Donc je vous présente Olga von Schubert, que j'ai rencontrée à Berlin l'année dernière et qui est ton titre exact, c'est Arts and Research Manager à la Haus der Kulturen der Welt à Berlin. Elle est aussi une curatrice indépendante. Elle a notamment mené plusieurs expositions à Dresde, je crois, et bientôt en Suisse. Et je lui ai demandé, j'avais vraiment envie qu'elle vienne nous parler un peu empiriquement de ces projets que j'ai découverts à Berlin l'année dernière et qui m'ont beaucoup fasciné, notamment le 100 Jahre Gegenwart programme, qui est un très large programme sur 4 ans, je crois, 3 ou 4 ans, et qui a plusieurs entrées. Et c'est vrai que à la fois les programmes de la Haus der Kulturen der Welt et le lieu me sont apparus comme très emblématiques du contemporain. Voilà. Donc, it's your time. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, Lionel, for inviting me, and I'm really happy to have the chance to say a few words about 100 years of now, 100 Jahre Gegenwart in German. So what was just mentioned, the confusion of vocabulary is already present in our own project title, because our German version is 100 Jahre Gegenwart and the English version is 100 years of now. So in the English version, the presentism is, so to speak, present, and in the German version, there's a coming together of different time in the term Gegenwart. So we have this problem built into the project already. And like Lionel said, it's a 4-year project from 2015 to 2019, and that's a very long time to be able to investigate the contemporary condition as exactly this coming together of different times, which Jacob just described so profoundly. However, we are not trying to add a theoretical position to this debate within the field of theory, but we try to develop contemporary practices that pay justice to this condition. So what I want to do is I want to show 3 examples of projects that the Haus der Kulturen der Welt launched. So they are not my curated projects, but I'm part of the team that sets up this frame of 100 years of now under which these projects are developed. I hope to show with this that cultural projects can contribute, maybe a little bit like poetry or art, to thinking the contemporary, and I want to show you how we try to bring together the different actors and protagonists of the contemporary. So in my first example, the Wohnungsfrage project, or housing question, I'm looking at moderation processes between contemporary positions. And the question here is, in what kind of formats can collective thought and action be enabled? So how can the brouhaha of the housing question be brought into a dialogue? So we started the 100 Years of Now with this exhibition, International Academy and Publication Series, which was curated by Hila Pelek, Jesko Feser, Nikolaus Hirsch, and Wilfried Kühn. And the project asked how housing is embedded in the structures of capitalism and what the direct effects of the increased real estate speculation and financialization of living space since the 1970s are for architects.
We just have the first slide. It's okay?
Yeah, I wonder.
Okay.
For architects, tenants, refugees, homeless people, and property owners. And the curators decided that this question could only be tackled combining 3 different temporal layers in one exhibition. One part was dedicated to historical solutions for the housing question, from kibbutzim in Israel to social housing projects in Cuba and many more. And another part consisted in works by contemporary artists, with Maria Eichhorn, which you can see on the screen, showing, for example, the layers of historical buildings that used to stand on the ground of the House of World Cultures before World War II. And she also developed this map. She actually went to the Katasteramt in Berlin and found out in this area where our cultural center is, where the houses were before they were bombed. And it was mainly a Jewish quarter, and there was actually a clinic there by Hirschfeld, who was one of the first doctors who had an advanced theory of homosexuality. So it's there are these layers of history underneath our modernist architecture. I don't know if you know it, I don't have a slide actually of it yet, which she made visible within the space of the building. A third part of the exhibition was the work of 4 interest groups in the fields of housing, constituted in each case by a group of social activists or students brought into discussion with one international architecture firm. These 4 groups created the concepts for 4 one-to-one models of housing projects, which were shown in the exhibition space of HKW, each of them responding to concrete cases and contemporary conditions. These new models were not only no greenfield developments in the sense that they were developed out of these communities or expert groups, but they also implicitly built on historical discourses. So again, like the conceptual art piece, also these architectural models try to read historical concepts, and the team edited historical texts that were referring to the problems they were working at, such as, for instance, Martin Wagner's The Growing House. It's a text about the working group of the same name with very famous architects such as Egon Eiermann, Walter Gropius, Erich Mendelssohn, Hans Scharoun, and others, who together formulated plans for adaptable microhouses capable of being modified in accordance with changing socio-economic circumstances. And this historical text is in the book framed by a contemporary viewpoint by these 4 authors there, Tom Avermaty and others. And yes, I guess it's this idea of adaptability of both historical ideas, such as one of this growing house group, and housing concepts or solutions themselves, which is a conceptual element that recurs in the housing model developed by the protesters of a meeting house in the district of Pankow in Berlin. It's in Stillestraße 10. And it was a group of elderly people who protested against the closure of their self-organized meeting place. So they protested against gentrification, constantly just shifting and deferring the housing question to other areas. And they engaged in a dialogue with the London-based architecture collective Assemble, who then developed an apartment complex model, a model of a flat within a building, where tenants would be able to flexibly adjust their units to suit specific individual needs depending on changing financial situations. So you could either rent a 60 square meter living space for one party and use the whole of it when you have children or when you need the space to work, or you could reduce your apartment to half of that space and the rest would be used as a communal space owned by the collective or by the city. In another case of collaborations between the tenants initiative Cotti and Co., it's called, in Kreuzberg, Berlin-Kreuzberg, and the architecture studio Teddy Cruz, the group decided that there was no architectural solution for the complexity of the problem that they had posed for themselves, which was that the rents are rising due to gentrification in the area of Kreuzberg, and tenants are protesting against that. So instead of building an architectural model, they developed a mobile structure which they called Gecekondo. And Gecekondo is the Turkish word for informal architectures on the margins of large cities, self-built architectures. And the model they developed for the exhibition very much mirrored a little house which had been in the square of or the roundabout of Cottbusser Tor in Kreuzberg since 2012, and which the tenants movement had actually built up themselves, and which served as a meeting place for them to organize in their political struggle. The work of this architecture firm usually focuses on the living conditions on the US-Mexico border, so their discussions with the Cotillon Co. political group centered on housing in its broader context of immigration and marginalization. So it's the brouhaha of different voices, again, in this fight against gentrification, which was supposed to be captured with this Gece Kondo model. And it was supposed to be able to travel and carry the discourse to other places. There was also a film produced in the course of this project by Angelika Levi, Miete, Essen, Seele auf, Rent, Eating Up the Soul, alluding to a film titled by Fassbinder. And this film was shown in an installation in the exhibition, which had a kind of immersive quality, so to suggest that anybody that watched it could get involved in the movement themselves. So I show you a short excerpt from her film.
Einen Raum schaffen für gemeinsame Küche, Nähstube oder was weiß ich, Kinderbetreuung, Nachhilfe oder einfach so ein Kaffeeklatsch nach oben. Jeder bringt irgendetwas mit. Dieses Gemeinsame, das Teilen, vielleicht kann man auch später irgendwann sich gemeinsam ein Auto zusammen teilen.
Es war ja vorher auch schon viel weiter, dass ich Nachbarn geholfen habe, gegrüßt habe und was miteinander gemacht habe, die Hinterhand zusammengespielt. Aber sichtbar ist es erst geworden, als wir in die Öffentlichkeit gegangen.
Aber niemals haben Sie gedacht, dass eine Kopftuchfrau hier sitzt und eine atheistische Frau neben ihr sitzt oder was weiß ich.
Woher weißt du das?
Oder eine Muslima mit einem Jüdin zusammen nebeneinander Kaffee trinkt und aus sich Gespräche oder irgendwelche Projekte sich teilen, gemeinsam arbeiten. Das ist ja mit unserem Gece-Kondo aufgeblüht worden.
Yes, so in the first part, where the sound wasn't working just yet, one woman says it's the processes that are important. So, I think this film shows quite well the attempt of 100 Years of Now not to show what the contemporary consists of, but how it evolves. One actually quite sad side effect of this process, which you can look at there, is that this Cotillon Co movement made this turned this district into something even more attractive, so to speak. So it got more and more attention. So in a way, it also triggered the real estate investments and the rise of rents against which it protested in the first place. So I guess it's these re-evaluations and entanglements and shifts that we're trying to investigate. So the second example I want to talk about is an exhibition called Nervous Systems. And it was on display this year, curated by Anselm Franke together with an activist NGO called Tactical Technology Collective around Stephanie Hanke and Marek Tuschinski, whose goal is to educate the public about the phenomena of financialization of big data and surveillance and governance techniques. So the exhibition analyzed historical infrastructures, grids, or patterns which condition contemporary life, correlating between technology, social life, individual subjectivities, and also non-human actors. And the main contribution of the Tactical Technology Collective was this educational white room that you can see in the picture. And that was an allusion to an Apple store, obviously, and thereby also to a historical 1982 CompuServe advertisement in which the future appears as a clean white space with smooth surfaces where people wouldn't have to work anymore because computers would work for them. And the White Room in the Nervous Systems exhibition contradicted this image of smooth surfaces and presented research on what's going on behind the screens, so to speak. Visitors were able to educate themselves about questions such as what happens with my data, and what is the financial model of Google, what are alternative softwares I can use where I'm not spied upon, things like this. So it was a very practical, empowering place. And the second layer of the exhibition were works of art which were chosen so that they would not just visualize data as if data were an external object, but addressing the entanglements and the immersive power of the human-machine interactions as a grid of patterns, perception, desire, technology, and finance. And these artworks were positioned in the exhibition space to engage in a dialogue, again, with the third thread of the exhibition, which the curators called triangulations. They were based on research contributed by media historians. And this term triangulations, it refers to a technique in land surveying or cartography where the distance of two positions to each other is measured according to the distance to a third point. So in the social sciences, the term is used to describe the application of several methods to one phenomenon in order to come to higher validity. And these installations, on the one hand, drew connections between historically and spatially disconnected events or phenomena, and on the other hand, they were situated in proximity to other contemporary artworks within the exhibition space, illuminating them historically and aesthetically. This interplay of proximities in the exhibition mirrored the idea of the nervous system as a digital grid of data and the infrastructure of different actors connecting moods, tensions, and crises of industrial and technologized culture. So what you see here is a model of interconnections that actually my colleague Annette Bhagwati, who sits over there, she drew it herself to understand the different forces at work in the exhibition space. So you can ask her about the model later. I'm not getting into it too deeply. But I just really like the graph because it shows the amount of work that it is asked from a visitor of the exhibition to draw connections and perceive relations. Each of the triangulations is based on 3 or more disparate exhibits, photographs, film footage, objects, or other historical references out of which narratives are developed which illuminate a particular aspect of today's nervous systems. So I want to give you one example. There was one triangulation called Patterns of Life by Grégoire Chamaillou, and he collaged different historical references to understand one contemporary phenomenon. So the phenomenon he looked at was activity-based intelligence, which was introduced in 2010 by the highest authorities of the US intelligence community as a militarized rhythm analysis based on computer programs that fuse and visualize geospatial, temporal, and intelligence data to 3-dimensional time geography diagrams. These models, based on data mining, apply to trajectories of movements, so the lines that movements draw, are used to detect anomalies from learned behavioral trends. So it's used, for instance, in order to carry out preemptive strikes with drones in warfare and things like that. So in order to understand this quasi-military technique, Chamaillou did not research military history, but he looked deeper and broader into the history of science. One of the triangulatory exhibits which Chamaillou chose to illuminate this contemporary phenomenon is an experiment by physiologist Georges Demeny and his assistant, the chronophotographer and filmmaker Etienne Jumaret, from the end of the 19th century. They attached light bulbs to bodies or limbs of bodies of people with movement disorders, so somebody who was pulling his leg or something like that. And they took long exposure photographs of them while moving in the dark, so they were able to draw graphs from their movements and to study what grace is and how movement works. And second reference that Chamayou chose was a similar experiment, or one that built on the first, by Lillian and Frank B. Gilbreth. And in this case, they used the same method to make work more efficient. Again, they fixed these electrical bulbs on workers' hand, and they analyzed the trajectories in order to simplify the movements, to rid them of any useless detour. And that's a motive that is taken up in the film by Julien Prévieux, which I want to show you, which was very close in the exhibition to this installation. And the film was actually in itself a collaborative project.
In 1892, in the course of my research into aesthetics, I became interested in the physical properties of what we call grace. One of the most important characteristics of grace is that if we were to follow the body through space, its trajectory would form a line that has the essential aesthetic properties of continuity, symmetry, and regularity. I wanted to prove this with an experiment. I have fixed small lights that resemble electric jewellery onto the bodies of several dancers. I then filmed them as they danced in the dark under a red safe light, so that the photographic emulsion would record only the bright dots left by the lights on their bodies. The results were clear sinusoidal lines marking the trajectories taken by the head, shoulder, hip, knee, and ankle. The path of the light and the movement of the hand is clearly visible. Once the action has been studied and corrected, it is important that the worker be instructed in its exact movements. A wire is shaped to the exact path of each movement and is mounted to its corresponding position on the machine. This kind of motion model is akin to the wake left by an ocean liner. When you stand at the stern of a liner and watch the wake, you can easily visualize the changes of its course. The motion model renders the path of a motion visible. It also allows for the user to appreciate the value of a particular motion. The motion model makes tangible the notion that time is money, and unnecessary motion is therefore money lost forever. More powerful ways of seeing and designing movement boost the contemporary understanding of smart, mobile, and kinetic economies where industry players can capitalize on the technologization of motion. It will help propel the wider cultural shift from motion discipline to motion control, and from a modern science of motion to an advanced capitalism in motion.
Yeah, so far. So I think what Julien Prévieux's film adds or does alongside the research provided by Chamayou is to show the embodiment of these layers of time in the dancers and in the workers performing there. So this is an example for an interplay between a media historian and an artist, in the frame of 100 Years of Now. Both the triangulation and the dance film are embedded in this semantic grid within the exhibition, without which they would not have unfolded the same meaning. So I think with this example, this method of 100 Years of Now could almost be compared with what Abi Warburg called Verknüpfungszwang, so the compulsion to draw connections between remote phenomena in order to detect concealed or secret structures. The relation between the phenomena is a speculative one, not one of linear historical predecession or influence, nor one of visual resemblance or historical appropriation, but it's about inherent and mostly invisible structural, aesthetic, narratological, or even poetic connections between different historical techniques, between different technologies, or how Jacob Lund might call them relational machines. That's an expression I quite liked in his essay on the contemporary condition. What each of the references and artworks in the grid of the exhibition share is that they can be enumerated within one story, or told within one story. The decolonization, so to speak, of these narratives, because we're here to decolonize the now, might then, in our view, consist in making the historical layers and power structures visible in the first place, but also to disconnect them from their pre-existent narratives and resituate them in other stories. That is done in the exhibition, we hope, by creating aesthetic experiences as counter-images, like in the film, by transgressing disciplinary boundaries, by isolating and recombining phenomena. Which brings me to my third example.
In 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is dedicated to the question of language in the project 100 Years of Now, and we are working on that project with Bernd Scherer, Stefan Auer, Sima Reinisch, and me, and we are trying to address how words and concepts can reflect their own historical layers of meaning, or how they can possibly escape historical pre-shaped categories in order to get out of a circle of reproduction of discourses. So how can specific, local, particular positions be articulated when, first of all, the words they use are full of historical preconceptions, and when the semantics of words are increasingly being universalized in global capitalism? So our most important strategy for this project is to identify and invite the right speakers, so to speak, that bring in counterpositions to universal concepts. And the dictionary only has 12 entries, because each of the terms serve as examples for concepts that demand universal meaning. So the 12 words we look at are time, truth, forum, thing, body, market, violence, fear, animal, language, image, and justice. So it's not a very traditional dictionary in analyzing the history or the etymology of words, but it's more a discursive dictionary. And it's not so much about defining the terms, but to look at them in relation to each other, which maybe can be visualized with this installation by Nikolaus Gansterer. I'm trying to save up some time, so I'm skipping through the text. The Dictionary of Now aims to critically analyze the universalistic and essentialist elements in the terms, in the sense that it tries to deconstruct seemingly universal or autonomous meanings of words by relating them to local concepts and positions, and by embedding them inside specific discourses. So, for example, to speak about the notion of the thing, a few weeks ago we invited Arjun Appadurai, Tony Bennett, and Sharon MacDonald to look at the situation of the museum objects in the soon-to-be-closed ethnological museum in Berlin-Dahlem. So we didn't want to contribute another theoretical position to the thing theory, but rather provide a case study in which the notion of the thing can be reimagined by assembling different actors and cultural practices within institutions such as museums. So normally in the museum, objects are representatives of cultures or remote cultures or times, and it's very hard to get out of these categorization. And we try to ask how can the thing escape this presentism of the now in the sense of a contemporary normative framing. How can it enter the space of history and possibly an open future? And in his talk on mutable mobiles, Tony Bennett showed that things are always in a state of transition. They can be seen as active agents in processes that set time in motion. And he chose an object from the collection of the Ethnological Museum, a cloak made of woven bark, which was purchased in 1819 by the Royal Prussian Art Chamber. That was when Captain James Cook's collection was auctioned. And James Cook had acquired it from Vancouver Island in 1788. And from this item in this Berlin museum, which is soon to move elsewhere within Berlin to a new museum, Tony Bennett drew connections to the Prussian anthropologist Franz Boas, who worked in the American Museum of Natural History in the late 19th century. And there he included similar cloaks in his life group display of Northwest Coast Indians. So he didn't invent these kind of life groups, but he was very much in favor of them as a tool to showing the original social context. So with this kind of display, he wanted to criticize typological methods of exhibiting and have a more authentic view. But it's precisely this concept of cultural areas which he developed from these life groups, which prevents the objects from telling their own stories of migration, economic exchange, and encounter, and reduces them to representations of historically and spatially remote cultures. So the dictionary entry on the thing tried to investigate alternative perspectives on things, and we visited the depot in the Dahlem Museum. Not working. Anyway, it holds 35,000 objects, and only a few of them are wrapped up to move to the permanent exhibition of the Humboldt Forum, only a few hundred. So there will be many, many things kept in the depot for a long time. And they're legal papers, as one might call it, because Arjuna Padurai called them migrant objects, consists in nothing than index cards or arrival books from the 19th century. And so they are things understood as things that can be possessed and stored away. And we think it could only be acts of bringing together different temporal and disciplinary registers, which would be able to moderate dialogues between these things and their contemporaries. That's
Thank you. Thank you, Olga. That was really interesting, and I'm lucky to have seen all these projects last year. These three projects are quite different. Maybe the most multi-layered, complex, multiple is the first one, Wohnungsfrage. We don't know exactly what's the center of a Wohnungsfrage. There is an exhibition at the Haus der Kultur an der Welt. There is a series of books, or very important books, and there are all these social involvements, especially in Kreuzberg, Neukölln. The second one is more centered on an exhibition, nervous systems, whereas the last one is a more discourse format, even though there are some following ups. I'm lucky to know the Haus der Kultur an der Welt, but maybe people here don't know exactly what the Haus der Kultur der Welt, and I want to ask a very tricky question. And maybe I can ask this tricky question to the other members of the Haus der Kultur der Welt. Bernd, Stefan, Zima, what is the Haus der Kultur der Welt?
Okay,
How
I
could you
give
define?
a first answer and then I pass on. Well, it does not have a collection. I think that's quite important to say.
Maybe closer from the microphone.
So it's not a museum of things, but it's built as a Congress hall in 1957 as a present from the Americans to the city of Berlin and as a symbol of democracy at the time. It was in a very good position to be seen from the eastern part of the city, so it was also a symbol for socialism to show what Western democracy was. And in 1989, before the fall of the wall, actually it was turned into Haus der Kultur der Welt, so not just a Congress hall anymore, but it had this task to present cultures from outside of Europe.
But what is for you, Olga?
Yeah, just a little background. So now for me it's like a museum of the contemporary, with the contemporary consisting not of a specific collection but numerous positions and kinds of objects, problems, phenomena.
Do you want to answer to this question,
Here's a
Bernd,
microphone.
Stefan, or yeah, please.
Test.
Okay, we do it in a row. one after another, and we're adding to each other. Maybe to add what Olga just said to concept of the House of World Cultures. It's not just only to show a perspective on non-European cultures, but also to show different perspectives on Western culture. And this made, I guess, the examples Olga showed quite clear that we always, that the house always, when with these projects, looks on specific problems or phenomena, it always tries to reflect the history of Western cultures, modernity, and the origins of a specific thinking, which are really inscribed within not only the architecture, but only also in the concept of the house and the program. And I pass on.
I have to give a lecture later on, so so I will explain more or less 45 minutes the whole context or one approach. But to make it short, for me the house is kind of organism to develop ideas in a situation of deep transformation, where the old categories evidently are not working anymore. And one major point, and I think that is also interesting related to the debate we are just in about time, is to relate these categorical problems and issues we are tackling at the moment to concrete cultural and aesthetic practices, and not to stay on a just abstract level or conceptual level, but to some extent materialize these notions in curatorial practices. And I think Olga did a great job just showing three ways how we tackle the notion of time. It's not by thinking about time, but by relating time to political, aesthetical, social practices in order to rethink these practices.
Annette?
Just to add to
So
that,
Annette
I think
Bagwati, the first speaker was, I'm sorry, it's not a man interruption, it's Stefan Auer, Bernd Scherer, Annette Bagwati.
Just a quick to add on this. I think the notion of sort of constellations is quite important at the house. That bringing together, because of the you spoke about contemporalities, so bringing together different perspectives, where in the moment of bringing together, you create new temporality. So you evoke potentials that are in objects, that are in discourses, by creating a situation where all of a sudden certain perspectives come together and be activated. And I think that's quite important, what Ben just said, that it's sort of through the practice that also things evolve at the house, sort of new, it's very process-oriented, it's very experimental in the sense that you don't know what happens when these constellations all of a sudden are being produced. What will be the outcome? And I think this, that what you, Olga described with the Wohnungsfrage, these historical aspects, the perspectives that talk to or enter in a dialogue with contemporary concerns. All of a sudden, historical doesn't become is not historical anymore, but that's actually a perspective, a historical perspective that is activated in the very moment and enters into a dialogue, where then knowledge production is the outcome, because you all of a sudden generate new thoughts, new insights through bringing together these different perspectives, and I think that's quite an important aspect of the practice of the house as well.
A kind of factory of knowledge, to quote Gerald Raunig.
yeah, in the sense, yes.
An aesthetic factory of knowledge. We have a few minutes for a Q&A moment, so if you have any question for Olga or for the other members of the team, please, just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi. I'm interested in the form of exhibition, because the form of exhibition has a very particular history, and from what I see in contemporary curatorial practice, there's still problematic around the exhibition in terms of augmenting the exhibition with other forms, and then the exhibition existing in what I might call a form of public time. It's one of the reasons I'm still drawn to exhibitions, although I often find them irritating, is because of this shared context of public time and the kind of public orientation of the exhibition. So I was just curious to know, within HKV, how you're working with the exhibition and this expansion of the exhibition as a project, and how that relates to contemporaneity in terms of the temporal. I don't have a question, I apologise, but I'm curious about your ideas. Yeah.
I think, yeah, and
Whoever.
Well, I think it's a very important issue that we are actually struggling quite a lot. Like when we did Wohnungsfrage, for example, when do you what is the purpose of the exhibition, and is the term exhibition actually appropriate anymore? Because what you're trying to do is, at the same time, when you have sort of historical objects, you try to evoke, present historical perspectives, ideas that you reflect on in the now. At the same time, in developing what then looks like an exhibition, you have a whole process that takes over, in this case it was for over 2 years, that was actually as important as the outcome itself. So at which moment do you say, now this is the moment when we present the outcomes of our research, and is this to end there? Because a lot of some aspects of the exhibition, like the Gecekondo, is still living on in different contexts, but this doesn't show anymore. So what is it that we present here? I think this is something we, requires different strategies that we develop more or less successfully.
One also should add that we are not only involved in exhibition practices, we are also involved in performative practices. To make it short, but this is a short answer to this, is what Anselm, for example, did in the exhibition on nervous system was to try to develop a constellation within the exhibition which creates a kind of aesthetical dynamic for the visitor. So as a visitor, you are not looking at one object, but you get into dynamics of reading the whole exhibition through one perspective to the other perspective to the other. It's a kind of Leibniz monadology, which you are reading the whole exhibition, and it creates a kind of constellation, which is on the one side fixed because it's in space, but on the other side is done in a way that for the visitor it creates a dynamic. So this is one part. The other is that we create really performative projects. For example, the opening of 100 Years of Now was basically, or the opening of the Anthropocene project was the challenge was when we started the Anthropocene project was the issue that we were ourselves in this process, which was not ended yet. So we had to create a form, and I go a little bit to talk later on about this form, that the whole project, which was a 4 days program, created questions that did not give answer. And we also developed a form for this. I'm going to speak a little bit about this later on.
Yeah, but maybe just to add, I think you cannot leave out the exhibition space, because that's the only space of the project where anybody can enter, and all the other parts are still directed at certain groups and interest groups. And so I think the actual place and the actual institution is also important. Yeah.
And for me as a visitor, the exhibition is only a short part, a small part of the whole process. It's not exactly an exhibition venue for me. It's a place. It's a very big place where you can find different kind of rooms, amphitheaters, formats, and honestly, it's the most exciting place I know. Really, it's not because they're here, but it's really an exciting place, and it's a very exciting place because of the formats. They're very, very strong to play on the different formats: public, private, semi-private, and so on and so forth. So I would recommend to go to Berlin and to go to the Haus der Kultur event, whereas it's closed for the moment.
Yeah, not before February next year.
Perhaps to add just one. Thank you very much for
that's
better
true.
marketing we couldn't do. But since you mentioned the book project related to the housing project, this was very important for us because the whole book project opened a kind of historical but imaginary space from which to read our contemporary issues. So we had a whole research project just on the publishing project, and published at the end about 12 books, and they are all sold out more or less already now. So what Lionel was describing is when we are dealing with an issue. I mean, 100 Years of Now itself, you can read that way. The challenge is to develop a kind of multi-perspective approach and to develop kind of different imaginary spaces around the theme.
And Annette?
And the last, to add on that, that the formats that you were describing, they are really developed, at least that's what we try to do, out of the questions that Bernd was mentioning. So when we start a project, it's first to define the questions that actually are helpful to grapple with contemporary conditions or contemporary issues, such as Wohnungsfrage, such as the Anthropocene. And once you have that, then through research, through collaborations, also transdisciplinary collaborations, certain formats are developed, but out of this very question. So they're not just format for the format's sake, but we feel they are sort of suitable to come to terms and to make experience certain issues to come to understand and comprehend. And I think that's quite important.
Thank you. We're done. So I thank Olga and I thank all the members of the HKW team, and I'm sure we're going with this discussion after Bernd's talk.